Hey everyone, and welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. Tonight, we're not strolling through the grand forums or marveling at the aqueducts of ancient Rome. Instead, we're taking a detour down a much darker, stranger alley in history. While Rome is celebrated for its contributions to law, engineering, and philosophy, it also possessed a grimly inventive imagination for punishment. Methods so theatrical, so bizarre, and so profoundly unsettling that they echo through the centuries. These aren't just tales of justice, they are stories of fear, power, and spectacle. So, before we descend into the shadows of the past, take a moment to get comfortable. If you enjoy exploring the more obscure and curious corners of history, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes so you don't miss our future journeys. Let me know in the comments where you're joining us from tonight. It's always wonderful to see our community of night owls. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let the hum of the world fade away as we begin. Our first stop is a punishment that sounds more like a twisted fairy tale than a legal sentence. Pona Kule, or the penalty of the sack. This was not for petty thieves or common criminals. This was reserved for one of the most heinous crimes a Roman could commit: patricide, the murder of one's own father. The Romans believed such an act was a profound violation of natural and divine order. And so the punishment had to be equally unnatural, a complete erasure of the offender from the world. The procedure was a masterpiece of grim symbolism. The convicted person was first scourged with rods. Then their head was covered, and they were sewn into a large sack made of oxide. But they weren't alone in this suffocating darkness. To complete the ritual, a collection of live animals was placed in the sack with them, turning their final moments into a chaotic scene of primal terror. The choice of animals was deliberate and steeped in meaning. A dog was included, representing the loyalty the murderer had betrayed. A rooster was added, whose crowing was a symbol of the new day the condemned would never see. A viper, a creature of deceit and poison, mirrored the treacherous nature of the crime. And finally, a monkey, seen as a grotesque parody of a human, was included to signify the debased and inhuman nature of the killer. Imagine the horror inside that leather prison, the frantic scrabbling of the monkey, the hiss of the viper, the panicked yelps of the dog, all while being tossed and turned as the sack was carried through the streets. Once sealed, this bundle of man and beast was thrown into the nearest deep body of water, usually the Tiber River. The goal was not just death, but utter annihilation, denying the criminal a proper burial on land. Thankfully, this punishment was rare, revived by emperors who had a flair for the dramatic and a need to make a powerful statement. It wasn't merely an execution. It was a public lesson in morality, a horrific piece of theater designed to etch the ultimate taboo into the public consciousness. It was Rome's way of saying that some crimes are so vile, they place you outside the realm of humanity itself. A central pillar of Roman religious life was the eternal flame burning in the Temple of Vesta. Tending to this sacred fire was the duty of the Vestal Virgins, a sisterhood of priestesses who were, in many ways, the spiritual bedrock of the entire empire. Their purity was directly linked to Rome's safety and prosperity. If the flame faltered, or if a Vestal broke her vows, it was considered a terrifying omen, a sign that the city had lost the favor of the gods. These women were selected before the age of 10 to serve for a period of 30 years. For 3 decades, they were expected to live a life of immense honor, privilege, and, most importantly, absolute chastity. A broken vow of virginity wasn't just a personal failing. It was a national crisis, a spiritual treason that was believed to invite divine retribution upon all of Rome. The punishment, therefore, had to be as severe as the crime was perceived. If a Vestal virgin was found guilty of breaking her vow, she was sentenced to be buried alive. This was not a metaphor. She would be taken in a solemn procession to a place called the Campus Celeritis, or the Evil Field. There, a small subterranean vault had been prepared, an underground room that would become her tomb while she was still breathing. The reasoning behind this uniquely horrifying method was a chilling piece of legal and religious sophistry. The body of a Vestal was considered sacred and inviolable. Her blood could not be spilled by human hands without incurring the wrath of the gods. To circumvent this, the Romans devised a punishment where no blood was shed. By sealing her in an underground chamber, she would perish without a single drop of her sacred blood being spilled by an executioner. In the eyes of Roman law, the state was clean. Inside this dark, earthy cell, she was left with a few symbolic provisions: a single loaf of bread, a small pitcher of water, and an oil lamp to provide a fleeting flicker of light. These items were not for survival, but for ceremony, allowing the state to claim they had not directly starved her. Once she was inside, the entrance to the vault was sealed, and earth was piled on top, erasing her from the world of the living forever. The man who had been her partner in the crime faced a different, though equally brutal, fate. He was typically taken to the forum, stripped, and flogged to death in a public spectacle. His end was violent and swift, a stark contrast to the slow, silent, and psychologically torturing demise of the Vestal. Left to contemplate her fate in the suffocating darkness beneath the earth. And yet the life of a Vestal was one of immense prestige. They were some of the most independent women in Rome, afforded luxuries, prime seating at the Colosseum, and the unique power to pardon a condemned prisoner simply by encountering them on the street. But this power was conditional, hanging by the single, fragile thread of their vow. One mistake, one transgression, and the front row seat at the games was exchanged for a permanent, silent tomb. When we think of Roman punishment, the image of the cross is often the first that comes to mind. Crucifixion was Rome's signature method of public execution, a slow, agonizing, and deeply humiliating process designed to serve as a powerful warning to anyone who dared defy the state. It was brutal, efficient, and, above all, visible. But for the Romans, there was always room to add a creative and even crueler twist to their methods. This brings us to the inverted crucifixion. The act of crucifying someone upside down was not a common practice, but it was reserved for cases where the authorities wanted to make a particularly strong statement. It was an embellishment of terror, a way to take an already horrific fate and amplify its shame and suffering. It was the ultimate expression of the state's power over a dissenter's body. Perhaps the most famous account of this punishment is the martyrdom of St. Peter, according to tradition. When Peter was sentenced to be crucified in Rome under the reign of Emperor Nero, he made a final, humble request. Believing himself unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus, he asked to be crucified upside down. The Roman authorities, likely indifferent to the religious sentiment, would have seen it as just another variation on a theme and granted his request. Physiologically, dying upside down was even more torturous than a standard crucifixion. Blood would rush to the head, causing immense pressure, ruptured blood vessels in the eyes, and a swift, disorienting agony. the diaphragm would be put under intense strain, making each breath a desperate, suffocating struggle. It was a death that combined the slow pain of asphyxiation with the acute misery of intense cranial pressure. Over time, the symbol of the inverted cross took on a dual meaning. For Christians, it became the Petrine cross, a symbol of humility and piety in the face of martyrdom. Centuries later, however, this very image would be co-opted by horror films and countercultural movements, transforming it into a symbol of the demonic and anti-religious. For the Romans, however, the symbolism was much simpler. We control not only if you die, but how you die, and we can make it as memorable as we please. But Rome's cruelty wasn't reserved solely for criminals and enemies of the state. It was also turned inward upon its own legendary legions in a practice known as decimation. When you think of a team-building exercise, you likely don't picture this. It was a brutal form of military punishment applied to an entire cohort or legion that was judged guilty of cowardice, mutiny, or desertion. The process was a terrifying lottery of death. The disgraced unit was forced to line up, and every 10th soldier was selected by drawing lots. The unlucky man chosen from each group was then sentenced to death, but he wasn't executed by a professional. He was beaten or stoned to death by the other 9 men from his own group, his comrades, his tentmates, the men he had marched and fought alongside. The psychological impact was devastating. Not only did 1 in 10 soldiers die, but the survivors were forced to become the executioners of their own friends, shattering morale while simultaneously enforcing discipline through pure terror. To further their shame, the remaining soldiers were given rations of barley instead of wheat, and were forced to camp outside the fortified safety of the main legionary camp. The logic was cold and brutally effective. You will fear your commanders more than you will ever fear the enemy. Let's move away from the battlefield and into the quieter, more insidious world of psychological punishment. As the Roman Empire aged and eventually gave way to the medieval mindset, new tools of control emerged. Imagine a device designed not to kill you, but to force you into a state of agonizing stillness. This was the fork of heretics, a devilishly simple instrument of torture. It consisted of a metal rod with 2 sharp, double-pronged forks at each end. It was less a weapon and more a piece of cruel, enforced neck. The device was strapped around the victim's neck, with 1 fork positioned just under the chin and the other pressed firmly against the upper chest. Any downward movement of the head, even nodding off from exhaustion, would cause the sharp prongs to dig into flesh, 1 pair piercing the throat and the other the sternum. It wasn't designed for swift death or even significant blood loss. It was designed to exhaust the body and the will, forcing the wearer to remain rigid and alert for days on end. This fork was the ultimate tool for silencing dissent. It was used on those accused of heresy, blasphemy, or spreading ideas that challenged the authority of the church or state. To add a layer of psychological torment, the metal was sometimes engraved with the Latin words abjuro, meaning I renounce. The instrument of your pain was also a constant, silent command to confess your supposed sins. It was a slow, quiet, and deeply personal form of torture that broke the spirit through sheer exhaustion. But let's rewind back to a more classical Roman era, to a form of punishment that was anything but quiet and personal. Long before heretics' forks, if you betrayed the Roman Republic, they didn't just silence you, they threw you away, literally. Welcome to the Tarpeian Rock, a steep, jagged cliff on the southern side of Rome's Capitoline Hill. This wasn't just a geological feature. It was the state's designated method for disposing of its most reviled criminals. The rock earned its name from a dark legend. Tarpeia, a Roman maiden, promised to open the city gates to the enemy Sabines in exchange for what they wore on their arms, believing she would receive their golden bracelets. The Sabines, ever literal, entered the city and threw their heavy shields, also worn on their arms, upon her, crushing her to death. Her body was then cast from the cliff, forever linking her name with betrayal and a fatal fall. After this legend took root, the Tarpeian Rock became the standard place of execution for traitors, deserters, and perjurers. The process was a powerful public spectacle. The condemned was often paraded through the bustling Roman Forum, allowing the citizens to see justice being served before being forced to the edge of the cliff. There, with the heart of Rome laid out below them, they were hurled over the side to their death on the rocks below. The act was drenched in symbolism. To be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock was to be physically and spiritually ejected from the city. It was a declaration that you were no longer a part of the Roman world. The cliff's proximity to the great temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, the most important temple in Rome, only amplified this message. Your final view was of the gods themselves casting you out. While later Roman emperors would devise more elaborate and fiery punishments, the Tarpeian Rock remained a potent symbol of the Republic's unyielding justice. It was simple, brutal, and sent an unmistakable message about the price of treason. So, the next time you hear someone talk about being socially cancelled, just remember that in ancient Rome, the original cancel culture involved a much more literal and permanent drop. Now, let us step out of the dark dungeons and into the blinding sunlight of the Roman Colosseum. Amidst the roar of 50,000 spectators, the smell of sweat, sand, and blood hangs heavy in the air. This is the stage for one of Rome's most infamous and spectacular forms of execution. Damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to the beasts. This wasn't just a punishment. It was the headline act, a brutal form of public entertainment served up for the masses. The victims of this fate were a diverse group. They were the empire's most despised criminals, captured enemy soldiers, runaway slaves, and, most famously, early Christians who refused to renounce their faith. For them, the arena was the final stop. The roar of the crowd was not for them, but for the spectacle their demise would create. They were not seen as people, but as props in a grand, violent play. And it was indeed a play. The Romans rarely settled for a simple, straightforward execution. Victims were often forced into grotesque theatrical performances. A man might be dressed as the mythological musician Orpheus, given a lyre, and then torn apart by bears. Another might be tied to a stake to reenact the fate of Prometheus, pecked at not by an eagle, but by starved dogs. It was a perverse fusion of high culture and low brutality. Justice and entertainment rolled into one bloody package. The stars of the show, of course, were the animals. The Roman Empire's vast reach allowed it to import exotic and deadly creatures from all corners of the known world. Lions from Africa, bears from Caledonia, leopards from the east, and even crocodiles and elephants were brought in to awe the crowds and dispatch the condemned. These animals were often starved and intentionally agitated beforehand to ensure a ferocious and bloody display. Any notion of a fair fight was pure fantasy. The condemned, known as bestiarii, were typically sent into the arena unarmed, or at best with a useless wooden sword. The outcome was preordained. This was not a contest of skill or courage. It was a state-sanctioned slaughter. If an animal was reluctant to attack, handlers would use long pikes or hot irons to provoke it into a killing frenzy. The show, after all, must go on. Beneath the morbid entertainment lay a cold, calculated purpose. Damnatio ad bestias was a visceral demonstration of the power of Rome and the consequences of defying it. It was a message sent to millions. The empire has the power to tame the wild beasts of nature, and it has the power to dispose of its human enemies just as easily. It was social control through terror, broadcast to a captive audience. Interestingly, it was the Christian martyrs who ultimately subverted this spectacle by facing the beasts with unwavering faith, prayer, and even song. They transformed their execution from a display of Roman power into a testament of their own spiritual conviction. Their courage in the face of certain death became legendary, inspiring new converts and infuriating the Roman authorities, who found that the very tool they used to stamp out this new religion was instead helping it grow. Not every Roman death sentence ended in the roaring chaos of the arena or at the bottom of a cliff. For the Roman elite, the senators, generals, and nobles who moved in the highest circles of power, there was often a quieter, more dignified path to the grave. This was the practice of forced suicide. It sounds like a contradiction, but in the complex world of Roman honor, it was a very real, and sometimes preferred, form of execution. The process was one of chilling civility. If a powerful individual fell out of favor with the emperor, perhaps for plotting a coup or simply becoming too popular, they wouldn't be dragged through the streets in chains. Instead, they would receive a quiet visit from a messenger who would deliver a scroll. The message was never explicit, but always clear. You have brought dishonor upon yourself and the state. You are expected to do the honorable thing. This was, in effect, a grim ultimatum. Take your own life by sunset, or we will do it for you, and the consequences for your family will be dire. The honorable route came with perverse incentives. If the accused complied, their family would often be permitted to inherit their property and wealth. Their name might be spared from official condemnation, and their children could avoid the stain of treason. It was the Roman state's version of a severance package, paid for in blood. Many Roman nobles, steeped in Stoic philosophy, saw this as a final act of control in a life that had spun out of their grasp. They could stage their own exit, writing the final scene of their life's drama. The philosopher Seneca the Younger, accused of conspiracy against Emperor Nero, famously met his end this way. He calmly slit his wrists in a warm bath, discoursing with his friends and scribes until the very end, a performance of courage and acceptance. Now, let's leave the perfumed villas of the elite and travel to the other end of the social spectrum, to a punishment that was the complete antithesis of a dignified death. Meet the wooden donkey. This was not a tool for the powerful, but a crude instrument of pain and humiliation, typically used on petty criminals, disobedient slaves, and rebellious soldiers. It was designed for maximum suffering and public shame. The device itself was brutally simple: a tall, triangular wooden frame with the top edge sharpened to a thin, knife-like ridge. The victim was stripped and forced to straddle this sharp beam, so their entire body weight was concentrated on that single, agonizing pressure point. To intensify the torment, Heavy weights were often tied to their ankles, pulling them down further onto the unforgiving edge. The wooden donkey was not always intended to be fatal, though it certainly could be. Its primary purpose was often public humiliation and the enforcement of discipline. Imagine a merchant caught cheating his customers, forced to sit astride this device in the middle of a bustling market square, his pain a public spectacle and a warning to others. Roman generals also used it as a form of field discipline, a visceral reminder of the consequences of disobeying orders. This instrument of agony shows another side of Roman justice. While the elite were granted a quiet, honorable exit that preserved their family's legacy, the common person faced punishments designed for public degradation and physical torture. It's a stark reminder that in ancient Rome, the manner of your death, much like the quality of your life, depended heavily on who you were. There was no equality, even in punishment. In an empire without photographs, fingerprinting, or digital records, how did the Roman state keep track of its repeat offenders? The solution was as brutal as it was effective. They turned the criminal's own body into their record. This was the practice of branding, not the kind corporations use for marketing, but the literal searing of a permanent mark of shame onto a person's skin. The process was swift, public, and excruciating. A metal rod with a letter or symbol at its tip was heated in coals until it glowed red hot. It was then pressed into the flesh, usually on the forehead or cheek, where it could never be hidden. The letter often signified the crime: F for fur thief, K for calumniator, false accuser, or fug for fugitivus, a runaway slave. It was a permanent mugshot. The true punishment of the brand began long after the physical wound had healed. It was a social death sentence. A branded person was an instant outcast, their crime announced to every stranger they met. They would be denied work, shunned in the marketplace, and treated with suspicion for the rest of their lives. They became a walking, breathing warning to others, a permanent piece of state propaganda. Some desperate individuals attempted to disguise their brands with tattoos, hairstyles, or even by intentionally scarring the area to obscure the mark. But the Roman authorities were always one step ahead. The act of tampering with one's own brand was made a crime in itself, ensuring that the state's judgment was as inescapable as the scar it left behind. From marking the skin, we now turn to a punishment that targeted something even more fundamental: a person's voice. In ancient Rome, freedom of speech had its limits, and crossing them could cost you your tongue. This punishment, tongue removal, was the state's chillingly literal response to words it deemed dangerous. If your speech was a weapon against the empire, Rome would disarm you permanently. The crime was often labeled as blasphemy, but this was a broad term. It could mean publicly insulting the traditional Roman gods, but it more frequently applied to seditious speech against the emperor, who was often considered divine. Questioning the emperor's authority or spreading rebellious ideas was seen as an attack on the very fabric of the state. And the source of that attack, the tongue, was targeted directly. The procedure was as crude as it was horrific. Without anesthesia or sterile instruments, the executioner would forcibly pull the victim's tongue out with forceps and sever it with a blade. The purpose was twofold: to inflict immense pain and to create a living example of the consequences of dissent. Even if the victim survived the bleeding and infection, they were left in a state of profound isolation, unable to speak, to eat properly, or to cry for help. These two forms of punishment, while different, served a similar purpose. Branding was an assault on your social identity, forever marking you as other. Tongue removal was an assault on your personal identity, erasing your ability to express yourself. Together, they show a system of justice that sought not just to punish a crime, but to control and redefine the very essence of the person who committed it. Just when you might think the catalog of human cruelty has been exhausted, history presents us with another instrument of breathtaking horror. This one is less about a quick death and more about the slow, methodical deconstruction of a human being. We now turn to the breaking wheel, a device so infamous its name alone is enough to conjure images of ultimate suffering. It wasn't just an execution. It was a form of macabre public art with the human body as the canvas. The process began with the condemned being tied to a large, heavy cartwheel, their limbs spread-eagled across the spokes. An executioner, often a man of immense physical strength, would then approach with a heavy iron bar. His task was not to kill, but to break. He would systematically strike the victim's arms and legs, shattering the bones in multiple places. The goal was to destroy the body's structure, while keeping the person alive and conscious through unimaginable pain. Once the limbs were rendered limp and shattered, the truly grotesque phase of the punishment began. The executioner would then take the broken, pliable body and weave it through the spokes of the wheel. Arms and legs were bent at unnatural angles, threaded in and out of the wooden beams like yarn in a nightmarish loom. The victim was transformed from a person into a broken, twisted effigy of suffering. This gruesome display was then hoisted high up on a pole, leaving the victim, often still breathing, to face their final hours, or even days, exposed to the elements, tormented by birds of prey. Their broken form served as a horrifying warning to all who passed below. It was the ultimate public deterrent, a spectacle of pain that lingered long after the execution itself was over. This punishment was reserved for the most heinous of crimes: aggravated murder, treason, and acts of extreme violence. In some cases, a small measure of mercy might be shown. The executioner could be instructed to grant a coup de grace, a blow of grace, with a fatal strike to the chest or neck, either at the beginning or the end of the ordeal. This mercy was the difference between a swift death and a prolonged, agonizing one. Survival on the wheel was nearly impossible, but the true horror was in the slow, inevitable decline from shock, dehydration, and exposure. While its roots are ancient, the breaking wheel became a grim hallmark of justice in medieval and early modern Europe, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire, where it was used for centuries to punish the worst of the worst. The device is also known as the Catherine wheel, named after Saint Catherine of Alexandria. According to legend, the 4th century Christian martyr was sentenced to be executed on a spiked wheel. When she touched it, however, it miraculously shattered. She was ultimately beheaded, but her name became forever associated with this instrument of torture she defeated through faith. In the end, the breaking wheel represents the pinnacle of punishment as public spectacle. It was a method designed not merely to end a life, but to disassemble it in the most visible and terrifying way possible. It communicated the absolute power of the state to not just kill a person, but to unmake them, piece by broken piece. From the loud, brutal shattering of bone, we now descend into a punishment that is horrifying in its silence. When it came to inventive cruelty, ancient Rome, and particularly certain emperors, had a seemingly bottomless imagination. Let's explore one of its lesser-known but profoundly disturbing methods: execution by hot ash. This wasn't a death of spectacle and screams, but of slow, grainy, and inescapable suffocation. The primary architect of this gruesome method was said to be Emperor Nero, a man who viewed executions as a form of performance art. In one recorded instance, an enemy of the emperor was buried in a pit up to their neck. This was a terrifying predicament on its own, but it was only the beginning. The true horror was administered not with a blade, but with a simple funnel and a container of ash. Hot ash was then slowly poured through the funnel into the victim's mouth. The horror of this method lies in its subtlety. At first, it's just dust, but it is scorching hot. It clogs the throat, fills the lungs, and turns every desperate gasp for air into an act of searing pain. It is death from the inside out, a slow-motion choking where your own breath becomes the agent of your demise. The symbolism was as suffocating as the method itself. Ashes were what remained after destruction. They were associated with waste and worthlessness. To be executed by ash was the ultimate humiliation. It meant you were not even worthy of a clean death by the sword or a dramatic death by fire. You were simply refuse, a piece of filth to be erased with the dust of what was already burned and forgotten. From the quiet horror of ash, we turn to another of Nero's favorites, a method that was anything but silent. This was the tunica molesta, which translates literally to the annoying tunic, but a more accurate name would be the flammable death robe. It was a gruesome garment designed for a truly spectacular and agonizing end, turning a human being into a living pyre. This tunic was made of coarse fabric and then thoroughly soaked in a cocktail of highly combustible materials: pitch, oil, tar, and sometimes sulfur. This garment was then placed on the condemned person, fitting snugly like a second skin. Once the victim was dressed in their death robe, they were restrained, often to a stake, and the tunic was set ablaze. The most infamous use of the tunica molesta occurred during Nero's extravagant nighttime garden parties. To illuminate the festivities, he would use condemned prisoners, often Christians, as human torches. They were lined up, set on fire, and their burning bodies provided the ghastly light for the emperor's entertainment. The screams of the dying became the soundtrack to an imperial. Both of these punishments, death by ash and the tunic of fire, are hallmarks of a particular kind of Roman cruelty, one that was personal, theatrical, and deeply psychological. They were not merely methods of execution, they were elaborate productions of death, designed to showcase the boundless and terrifying power of an emperor who saw human suffering as just another form of art. Most of the punishments we've explored, however horrific, end with the death of the body. But there was one Roman punishment that reached beyond the grave, designed to kill something far more enduring than flesh and bone: a person's memory. This was damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. And it was, perhaps, Rome's most profound and chilling form of retribution. When a powerful figure, a disgraced emperor, a failed usurper, a traitorous general, was subjected to damnatio memoria, the state mobilized to erase them from history itself. Their statues were torn down, their portraits were destroyed, and their name was meticulously chiseled off every public building, monument, and inscription across the vast expanse of the empire. It was an officially sanctioned act of historical vandalism on a massive scale. One of the most famous examples was the fate of Emperor Geta after he was murdered by his own brother. The Emperor Caracalla, a sweeping condemnation of his memory was ordered. Geta's face was scraped from family portraits, His name was removed from documents, and his statues were smashed. In surviving artifacts, we can still see the ghostly voids where his image once was. A chilling, tangible silence in the historical record. The goal was to make it seem as though the person had never existed at all. Yet, the erasure was never perfect. These awkward gaps, recarved faces, and edited inscriptions serve as haunting reminders of the person who was meant to be forgotten. History, it seems, has a memory of its own, and the very act of trying to erase someone leaves behind a scar that tells its own story. Ultimately, damnatio memoria was an instrument of absolute political control. It wasn't just about punishing the dead, it was about warning the living. By demonstrating the power to rewrite the past, an emperor could shape the future, eliminating the ideas and influence of their enemies. It was the state's way of saying, not only can we end your life, we can make it so you never had one. In our modern world, we talk of digital erasure and being cancelled. But the Romans were practicing this 2,000 years ago with hammers and chisels. And so, as we conclude our journey through the darkest corners of Roman justice, we arrive at this final, sobering thought. The most terrible punishment was not the bite of a lion or the heat of the fire. It was the cold, calculated, and eternal silence of being forgotten. But the fall of Rome did not signal an end to humanity's grim creativity. As the classical world gave way to the fragmented kingdoms of the Middle Ages, new societies emerged, and with them, new and equally bizarre methods of punishment. The tools and titles changed, but the fundamental instinct for brutal, symbolic justice continued to evolve in strange and terrifying ways. Our journey into the night is far from over. As the grand structures of Roman law crumbled and gave way to the fragmented, faith-drenched world of the early Middle Ages, a new form of justice emerged. It was a system built not on evidence or testimony, but on a profound belief in divine intervention. Welcome to the age of the trial by ordeal, a legal process where the accused was subjected to a dangerous, painful test, the results of which were believed to reveal the very judgment of God. The underlying logic was simple, yet terrifying. It was believed that a just and all-powerful God would not allow an innocent person to be harmed or convicted. Therefore, surviving an ordeal or showing miraculous signs of healing was considered proof of innocence sent directly from heaven. The court's audience wasn't just the local villagers, it was the Almighty Himself, and the verdict was His to deliver. One of the most common forms of this divine appeal was the ordeal by fire. In one version, the accused was forced to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a set distance. In another, they had to walk barefoot and blindfolded across a path of scorching hot plowshares. The test was not about enduring the pain, but about what came next. The real judgment came 3 days later. Immediately after the trial, the burned hand or feet were bandaged and sealed by a priest. After 3 agonizing days of waiting, the bandage was ceremoniously removed. If the wound was found to be healing cleanly, free of infection, it was a divine sign of innocence. If it was festering and purulent, it was proof of guilt, and the accused would face further punishment. It was a verdict decided not in a moment, but in the quiet, anxious darkness of the following days. Then there was the ordeal by water. This too came in 2 distinct flavors. The ordeal of hot water required the accused to plunge their bare arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a consecrated stone or ring. Just like with the hot iron, the subsequent healing of the burn over 3 days would determine their fate. More famously, there was the ordeal of cold water, which became a cruel catch-22 for those accused of witchcraft. The accused, often bound hand and foot, was thrown into a river or pond. Since water was a pure element, it was believed it would reject anything impure. Therefore, if the person floated, they were deemed guilty, rejected by the sacred water. If they sank, they were innocent. The only problem was that the innocent person, having been accepted by the water, had likely already drowned. For several centuries, these trials were a legitimate and widely used legal tool, presided over by clergy who would pray and perform rites to call upon God to show his judgment. It wasn't until 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, that the Church officially forbade priests from participating in such rituals. Without the Church's blessing, the ordeals lost their divine authority, slowly paving the way for systems based on evidence and jury trials. Trial by ordeal reveals a worldview where the line between the natural and the supernatural was porous, where faith was the ultimate arbiter of truth. It was a system of justice born from a desperate need for certainty in a chaotic world, a system that placed human fate not in the hands of other mortals, but in the silent, inscrutable judgment of God. As the formal procedures of trial by ordeal faded, medieval justice often shifted its focus from divine judgment to a more earthly concern: social order. In the small, tightly knit villages and towns of the Middle Ages, your reputation was your currency. As such, one of the most effective forms of punishment was not death or imprisonment, but organized public humiliation. These were punishments designed to shame you in front of your neighbors and enforce conformity. Enter the scold's bridle, or the brank. This was a particularly cruel device, reserved almost exclusively for women. It was an iron cage that was fitted over the head and locked in place. It was the designated punishment for a scold, a woman accused of gossiping, nagging, arguing, or otherwise speaking out of what was considered her proper place. In a patriarchal world, it was a brutal tool for enforcing female silence. The true horror of the bridle was a small piece of metal inside the cage, known as a bit. This plate, often covered in spikes, was inserted into the woman's mouth and pressed down firmly on top of her tongue. This made speech not only impossible, but excruciatingly painful. Any attempt to make a sound would result in the tongue being pierced or lacerated. It was a mask of silence, enforced by pain. The punishment didn't end with wearing the device. The woman was then paraded through the town, often led by a leash like an animal, for all her neighbors to see. The public was encouraged to mock, jeer, and ridicule her, reinforcing her shame. It was a ritual of degradation designed to strip a woman of her dignity and voice, sending a clear message to any other woman who dared to speak too freely. From the sin of gossip, we turn to another common vice of the era: public drunkenness. For this, authorities had an equally visual and humiliating punishment: the drunkard's cloak. This wasn't a cloak at all, but a heavy, bottomless wooden barrel fitted with a hole for the person's head and two more for their arms. The offender was forced to wear this clumsy, uncomfortable garment as their punishment. Forced to don the cloak, the drunkard had to walk through the town, their crime literally hanging on their shoulders for everyone to see. The weight and awkward shape of the barrel made it difficult to walk, forcing them to stumble and waddle, physically parodying the unsteady gait of a drunk. It was a punishment that made the crime its own visible spectacle, sometimes to increase the discomfort and shame. The barrel would be filled with horse manure, mud, or dirty water, making it unbearably heavy and foul-smelling. The message was simple and visceral, a piece of street theater that everyone, from children to elders, could understand. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a living cautionary tale. Both the scold's bridle and the drunkard's cloak were instruments of social engineering. They weren't designed to kill the body, but to correct behavior by mortifying the spirit. They reveal a world obsessed with maintaining a strict social hierarchy and moral code, where the most effective prison was often the judgment of your own community, and the sharpest sentence was the laughter and scorn of your neighbors. Beyond the shame of the barrel and the silence of the bridle, there were punishments designed not just to humiliate, but to make a person's very death a prolonged public spectacle. In the grim landscape of medieval England and Europe, few sights were as terrifying as the gibbet. This was not a quick drop on the gallows. This was a slow, agonizing process of being displayed to the world as you wasted away. The gibbet, or hanging cage, was a cage of iron bars, roughly forged into the shape of a human body. It was designed to be a tight fit with separate sections for the arms, legs, and head, effectively immobilizing the person trapped inside. Sometimes the victim was executed first, but for the most heinous crimes, they were placed into the cage alive. The iron door was shut, locked, and the true punishment began. Once the victim was secured inside this human-shaped prison, the entire cage was hoisted high into the air. It was hung from a pole or a beam at a prominent public location, often at a major crossroads, near the seacoast to warn pirates, or directly at the scene of the crime. Here, the condemned was left, exposed to the blistering sun, freezing rain, and biting winds. For those placed in the gibbet alive, the end was torturously slow. It was a death by inches, brought on by dehydration, starvation, and exposure. Days would bleed into nights, with no escape from the elements or the constant gaze of the public. Imagine being trapped, unable to move, as Friday turns into Saturday every minute. Like the one passing now at 2:09 a.m., stretching into an eternity of suffering, high above the world that has already forgotten you as a person. But the gibbet's purpose extended long after death. The body was intentionally left to rot within the cage, to be picked apart by crows and other carrion birds. The skeleton would remain, rattling in the wind for years, a permanent and gruesome landmark. It was a potent warning to all who passed, a constant reminder of the price of piracy, murder, or treason. This method was especially popular for punishing highwaymen and pirates, whose crimes disrupted the vital arteries of trade and travel. Placing their decaying bodies at the crossroads they once plagued was a form of symbolic justice, a message that the law, in the end, would always loom larger than the outlaw. It was a grim form of social control, a world away from the quiet, modern plains of places like the Punjab. The gibbet blurred the line between execution and monument. It turned a human being into a permanent fixture of horror, a decomposing scarecrow meant to frighten other potential wrongdoers. It was the state's way of ensuring that even in death, the criminal continued to serve a public purpose, their body becoming a lasting testament to the power of the law. From the cold, lonely decay of the gibbet cage, we now turn to a punishment of heat, spectacle, and terrifying religious conviction. In the medieval world, there was no crime considered more dangerous than heresy. It was not seen as a simple disagreement on doctrine, but as a venomous spiritual plague that could infect the entire community and condemn countless souls to hell. The response to such a threat had to be absolute, and for many, the ultimate answer was fire. Burning at the stake became the signature punishment for those deemed unrepentant heretics. The logic behind this method was deeply symbolic and twofold. First, fire was seen as a purifying element. By consuming the heretic's physical body, it was believed that the community could be cleansed of their corrupting influence. Second, the flames were a terrible, earthly preview of the hellfire that, according to doctrine, awaited the sinner in the afterlife. The execution itself was a highly ritualized public event. The condemned was often forced to wear a bonito, a yellow penitential garment painted with images of demons, dragons, and flames. A tall, conical hat, similarly decorated, was placed on their head. This procession to the stake was a final act of humiliation, marking them as an outcast from the Christian world before their body was even touched by the fire. At the site of execution, a tall wooden post was driven into the ground. The victim was tied securely to it, and bundles of wood and straw were piled high around their legs and torso. In some cases, as a supposed act of mercy to speed up the agonizing process, a bag of gunpowder would be hung around the person's neck, intended to explode from the heat and end their suffering more quickly. The moment the pyre was lit, the event transformed into a horrifying piece of theater. Huge crowds would gather to watch, a mixture of the pious, the fearful, and the morbidly curious. The flames would leap high into the night sky, a stark and terrible beacon against the quiet darkness that settles over a place like Burwala at this late hour. For those watching, it was a visceral sermon on the consequences of straying from the faith. This fate was not reserved just for the unknown. Figures who would later become martyrs and national heroes, such as Joan of Arc in France and the religious reformer Jan Hus in Bohemia, were subjected to this fiery end. Their deaths demonstrate that no one, regardless of their perceived righteousness or popularity, was safe from an accusation of heresy. The act of burning at the stake was far more than a simple execution. It was a complex ritual designed to destroy the body, terrify the faithful into obedience, and symbolically cleanse the community of a spiritual threat. It was the ultimate expression of an age where religious certainty was absolute, and the price for challenging it was to be consumed by purifying flame. Let us now steer our ship away from the shores of continental Europe and sail north into the cold, misty fjords of the Viking Age. Here, justice was not always a matter of state law or religious doctrine, but often a raw, personal, and brutal affair dictated by codes of honor and revenge. In the annals of horrifying punishments, few are as notorious or as debated as the one known as the blood eagle. The blood eagle stands as a testament to the fearsome reputation of the Norsemen. Its very description sounds like something from a dark myth, and for centuries, historians have argued whether it was a real, practiced ritual or a piece of literary savagery designed to make enemies tremble. Real or not, its legend is a chilling glimpse into the Viking warrior ethos. According to the Norse sagas and poems that describe it, the process was a gruesome masterpiece of cruelty. The victim, usually a captured king or a reviled enemy who had committed a great offense, was forced to lie face down. The executioner would then use a sharp blade to carve the outline of an eagle with spread wings onto the person's back. The next step escalated the horror exponentially. The executioner would hack through the ribs along the spine, breaking them and pulling them outwards to create a pair of bloody, flesh-covered wings. The agony of this act alone would be beyond comprehension. It was a method designed not just to kill, but to utterly dismantle a person's body in a symbolic and terrifying display. In the alleged final act of the ritual, the victim's lungs were pulled out from their chest cavity through the openings in their back. They were then laid over the wings of the ribs. The sagas suggest that the final, fluttering breaths of the dying person would cause the lungs to move, resembling the gentle motion of an eagle's wings. This last, quiet flutter is a chilling image, a stark contrast to the profound stillness of a night at this late hour. This was not random violence. It was said to be a ritual with deep religious meaning. The blood eagle was considered the ultimate human sacrifice to Odin, the Allfather, the Norse god of war and poetry. To perform it was to offer up one's most hated enemy to the highest of the gods, a final, definitive act of vengeance and devotion that would be celebrated in song and story. It is important to note, however, that many modern historians are skeptical. No definitive archaeological evidence of the blood eagle has ever been found. Some scholars argue that the accounts are misinterpretations of complex Norse poetry, while others suggest they were tales fabricated by Christian writers to portray the pagan Vikings as inhuman monsters. Whether the blood eagle was a real ritual or a terrifying piece of fiction, its story served a powerful purpose. It was a key element of the Vikings' psychological warfare. The legend itself was a weapon, crafting an image of a people so fierce, so devoted to their gods and their revenge, that they were capable of a cruelty that bordered on the divine. Our journey now takes us eastward, leaving the world of European castles and Viking longships for the ancient, sprawling empire of China. Here, we find a system of justice that was deeply intertwined with philosophy, cosmic order, and a bureaucratic precision that could be terrifying in its application. This brings us to a punishment known as linki, a name that sends a chill down the spine. The lingering death, or, as it's more famously known in the West, death by 1,000 cuts, reserved for only the most unforgivable crimes, such as high treason or the murder of one's parents. Linki was not merely an execution. It was a methodical process of erasure. It was considered the most severe punishment in the imperial Chinese legal code, a fate worse than a simple, clean death. Its purpose was to inflict maximum suffering and shame, not just on the body, but on the spirit itself. The process was a grim public spectacle. The condemned was taken to a public square and tied to a wooden frame. Then, an executioner with a series of sharp knives would begin the slow, systematic removal of small portions of flesh from the victim's body. The cuts were precise, designed to prolong the ordeal for as long as possible, sometimes for hours or even days, all while keeping the victim conscious. Linki was, in essence, a punishment on 3 distinct levels. The first was the public humiliation, being exposed and dismantled before a crowd. The second was the prolonged and almost unimaginable physical agony of the process itself. But it is the third level that reveals the true depth of its horror, and it is rooted in traditional Chinese spiritual beliefs. In this belief system, the body must be whole at burial for the spirit, or poor, to be at peace in the afterlife. A mutilated body meant a mutilated spirit, doomed to wander forever, never finding rest. Linki, by systematically dismembering the body, was therefore a sentence of eternal punishment. It was a concept of unending torment, hard to fully grasp in the quiet of a South Asian night, where even the longest hours before dawn, like the one passing now at 2:14 a.m., eventually end. In some later accounts of the punishment, particularly from its final years in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it is said that the victim was sometimes given opium. Whether this was a small act of mercy to dull the senses, or a practical tool to prevent the victim from passing out from shock and thereby prolong the execution, remains a point of historical debate. Western observers who witnessed or heard of Linky were horrified, and it became a symbol in their eyes of Oriental despotism. Photographs of one of the last known Linky executions, carried out in 1905, circulated globally and contributed to the international pressure that led China to formally abolish the practice that same year. Ultimately, Linky was the ultimate demonstration of imperial power. It was a punishment designed to obliterate a person on every conceivable plane of existence, physically in front of a crowd, socially through shame, and spiritually for all eternity. It was a terrifyingly precise method of ensuring that the consequences for defying cosmic and imperial order were absolute, leaving the meticulous cruelty of imperial China. Our journey now takes us south to the vibrant and ancient cultures of India and Southeast Asia. Here, for thousands of years, the ultimate instrument of state power was not a blade or a rope, but a living, breathing creature of immense strength and intelligence, the elephant. Execution by elephant was a long-standing and terrifyingly effective form of capital punishment. The choice of the elephant as an executioner was a practical one. Elephants are smart enough to be trained for complex tasks and strong enough to kill a human with terrifying ease. Under the guidance of its handler, or mahout, an elephant could be instructed to dispatch a condemned prisoner in a number of ways, ranging from mercifully quick to protractedly torturous. The most common method was death by crushing. The prisoner was forced to the ground in a public square, and the elephant would be commanded to raise its massive foot and bring it down upon the person's head. The result was instant, spectacular, and gruesome, a definitive and public end. This was often considered the swiftest version of the punishment, but for those the state wished to make a greater example of, the elephant could be used as an instrument of torture. An expertly trained animal could be directed to break the victim's limbs, one by one, methodically crushing their arms, legs, and hips underfoot before the final, fatal blow was delivered. This demonstrated a horrifying level of control, a fusion of animal might and human intention. This was always a public spectacle, designed to project the power and authority of the ruler. The elephant was a symbol of royalty and divinity, so to be executed by one was to be crushed by the very symbol of the state. It was a display of power utterly foreign to many cultures, a world away from the agricultural plains of a region like the Punjab, where life was tied to the soil, not the whims of a king's beast. In some regions, the method was made even more fearsome. Large, sharp blades, like giant tusks of steel, were sometimes fitted to the elephant's own tusks. The animal would then be provoked into goring the victim, combining the horror of being pierced with the unstoppable force of a charging beast. European travelers to the region in the 16th and 17th centuries wrote about this practice with a mixture of awe and horror. Their vivid accounts, read by candlelight back in Europe, detailed a form of justice that seemed both exotic and barbaric. These stories from a world away, describing spectacles of terror under a hot sun, are a stark contrast to the deep, quiet peace that settles over a place in the small hours of the morning. The practice eventually faded under the influence of European colonial powers, who replaced it with their own methods of justice. Execution by elephant stands as a unique example of a state harnessing the raw power of the natural world for its own ends. It was a punishment that was both symbolic and brutally real, a demonstration that the ruler's authority was as absolute and as crushingly powerful as the magnificent creature that served as his executioner. Let us now journey across the ocean to a world untouched by Rome or the Vikings, to the heart of the powerful and sophisticated Aztec Empire. Here, in the Valley of Mexico, justice, religion, and the very continuation of the cosmos were inextricably linked. The Aztec worldview was one of cyclical destruction and rebirth, and it demanded elaborate, often bloody, rituals to keep the universe in balance. We now explore a ritual so gruesome it challenges our modern understanding of punishment and worship. This is the rite of Xipe-Totec, our Lord, the Flayed One. Xipe-Totec was the Aztec god of agriculture, spring, and renewal, and to honor him, the Aztecs performed a ceremony that was a terrifyingly literal interpretation of death giving way to new life. This was not a punishment for common criminals. It was a ritual reserved for the most respected captives, brave enemy warriors, whose strength was deemed a worthy offering to the gods. The ceremony began with a form of gladiatorial combat. The captive was tied to a large, circular stone and given a mock weapon, a wooden club studded with feathers. He was then forced to fight several fully armed and elite Aztec warriors. The outcome was never in doubt. After the captive warrior was defeated and sacrificed, the main part of the ritual began. With incredible, chilling precision, Aztec priests would use razor-sharp obsidian blades to carefully flay the victim, removing their skin in a single, continuous piece. This was not an act of rage, but one of deep, ritualistic significance. What happened next is what makes this practice so profoundly bizarre. A priest would then dan the flayed skin of the sacrificed warrior, wearing it like a grotesque, dripping garment. For the next 20 days of the festival, the priest was Xipe-Totec, a living, walking embodiment of the god. He would perform rituals and dance, draped in another man's skin, a macabre spectacle that stands in stark contrast to the quiet solitude of a pre-dawn morning in a place like Buarwala, at just past 2:15 a.m. The symbolism, though horrifying, was central to Aztec agriculture. The priest, wearing the rotting, peeling skin, represented the husk of the dry earth shedding its dead layer. The living priest beneath the skin symbolized the new vegetation of spring pushing its way through. The flayed body was the empty seed pod, and the vibrant life within was the promise of a new harvest. It was the cycle of renewal made terrifyingly literal. This ritual demonstrates a worldview that can be difficult for us to comprehend. It was a form of punishment for an enemy warrior, yes, but it was also a sacred honor, a necessary sacrifice to ensure that the rains would come, the maize would grow, and the sun would continue to rise. It was an act of cosmic maintenance, performed on a human body. The rites of Xipe-Totec remind us that what one culture views as unspeakable cruelty, another can see as a sacred necessity. It was a system where the boundaries between punishment, sacrifice, and worship were not just blurred, but completely intertwined in a bloody, complex, and deeply meaningful tapestry. Let us now leave the solid ground of empires and kingdoms behind and venture out onto the vast, lawless expanse of the open ocean during the golden age of piracy. Here, far from the reach of any king or court, sailors and pirates created their own codes of conduct and their own unique and brutal forms of justice. On a ship teeming with desperate men, discipline was a matter of survival, and the punishments were as harsh as the sea itself. Among the most feared of all maritime punishments was keelhauling. The name itself is chillingly descriptive. It was a method of dragging a person under the keel or the central spine of the ship's hull. It was a sentence handed down for severe offenses, and it was a punishment that offered very little chance of survival. The process was brutally simple. A rope was looped beneath the ship, running from one side to the other. The offender was tied to this rope, and then, with the rest of the crew watching, he was thrown overboard and dragged down into the dark water, under the immense weight of the ship, and pulled up on the opposite side. The true horror of keel hauling was not just the drowning, but the hull itself. A ship's bottom was no smooth surface. It was a jagged landscape of sharp barnacles, rough-hewn timber, and splintered wood. As the victim was dragged across it, their skin and flesh would be torn to ribbons. The terror of being pulled into the dark, crushing water, combined with the searing pain of being scraped alive, was a stark contrast to the quiet air of a peaceful night, now at 2:21 a.m. For a more psychological, though equally grim, punishment, pirates practiced the art of marooning. This was the sentence for a thief or a deserter, to be abandoned on a deserted island with no hope of rescue. The isolation was the punishment, a slow death sentence delivered by the empty horizon. According to pirate tradition, the marooned man was often left with a few meager provisions, a small amount of water, a cutlass or knife, and a pistol loaded with a single shot. This single bullet presented a terrible choice. Was it a final act of mercy, offering a quick way out of a slow death by starvation or thirst? Or was it a tool, a last chance to hunt or defend oneself, prolonging a futile struggle for survival? This profound isolation is hard to comprehend for those of us surrounded by community in a place like the town of Burwala. It was a punishment that used the sheer, unforgiving vastness of the natural world as a prison cell. It was a sentence to be erased from the world of the living, left to be slowly forgotten by both man and sea. Both keel hauling and marooning were punishments born from the unique environment of a ship at sea. One used the vessel itself as an instrument of torture, while the other used the ocean as an inescapable prison. They were brutal, practical methods of enforcing order in a world where the only law was the one you made yourself, and the only judge was the unforgiving sea. We sail back now to the shores of Europe, but into a different era, the early modern period, from the 16th to the 18th centuries. This was an age of profound anxiety, a time when the fear of the devil and his earthly agents was not a metaphor, but a palpable, terrifying reality. This fear fueled the great witch hunts, and at the heart of this panic was a bizarre and invasive method of proof: the search for the witch's mark. It was widely believed that when a person made a pact with Satan, he would seal the deal by leaving a mark on their body. This mark, it was said, would be insensitive to pain and would not bleed when pricked. It was the devil's signature, a physical sign of a soul that had been sold. Any unusual blemish, a mole, a birthmark, a scar, even an odd patch of skin, could be interpreted as this damnable sign. This belief gave rise to one of the most humiliating rituals of the witch trials. An accused person, most often a woman, would be stripped and publicly examined by a panel of inquisitors or self-proclaimed witch-finders. Every inch of her body was scrutinized in a cold, methodical search for the supposed mark of the devil, turning any natural imperfection into a potential death sentence. Once a suspicious mark was found, the official witchbricker was called in. This was a person whose grim profession was to test these marks. Armed with long, sharp pins and bodkins, they would proceed to prick the accused blemish. If the person did not flinch or cry out, or if the spot failed to bleed, it was taken as irrefutable proof of witchcraft. The silence of the accused, whether from shock, stoicism, or sheer terror, would be twisted into an admission of guilt, a chilling thought in the deep quiet of the early morning. The entire practice was ripe for deception. Many witch-prickers were charlatans who preyed on the fears of terrified communities. They often used trick needles with retractable points that would appear to sink deep into the flesh without causing pain. By faking the results, they could prove the existence of a witch, collect their handsome fee, and move on to the next frightened town. The process was a form of methodical torture. Even if one mark was tested and found to be innocent, the pricker would simply move to the next and the next, jabbing and prodding the victim's body for hours. It was an investigation designed not to find truth, but to manufacture guilt, a system of manufactured fear, utterly alien to the communal trust one might hope to find in any close-knit place. The search for the witch's mark was an anatomy of paranoia. It shows how a society consumed by fear can create its own evidence, twisting the natural variations of the human body into signs of ultimate evil. The punishment began long before the trial. It began with the invasive search, the piercing needle, and the chilling moment when a simple birthmark was declared to be the signature of the devil himself. From the hidden, invasive search for the devil's mark, we now move back out into the open, to a punishment that was pure public theater. In the towns and villages of England and colonial America, one of the most common sights on a riverbank or near a pond was a strange contraption of wood and iron, the ducking stool. This was the preferred method for dealing with what society deemed disorderly women. The device itself was a chair or stool, sometimes ornately carved with mocking figures, fixed to the end of a long wooden beam that acted as a lever. The entire apparatus was positioned at the water's edge. The victim, strapped securely into the chair, could then be swung out over the water and plunged beneath its surface. While sometimes used for dishonest tradesmen, like a brewer who made bad ale, the ducking stool became infamous as a punishment for women. Its targets were scolds, gossips, or women who dared to argue with their husbands or challenge male authority. It was a tool designed to enforce subservience and silence women who were considered too loud, too opinionated, or too troublesome. The punishment was a deeply humiliating ritual. The convicted woman was paraded to the stool, tied into the chair, and then repeatedly dunked into the often frigid and polluted water. The crowd would jeer and mock as she was pulled up, sputtering and gasping for air, only to be plunged back under. The number of dips was at the discretion of the local magistrate, each submersion a terrifying gasp in the dark water, a world of chaos compared to the quiet, rhythmic breathing of someone listening peacefully at this late hour. The primary intent was not to kill, but to shame and shock the offender into compliance. However, the ducking stool could be deadly. The shock of the cold water could induce a heart attack, and accidental drownings were not unheard of. Furthermore, being repeatedly submerged in the filthy water of a town pond could easily lead to fatal illnesses later on. It's worth noting a small historical distinction. A cucking stool was technically just a chair in which an offender was tied up for public ridicule, similar to the stocks. The ducking stool was the specific instrument used for immersion in water. Over time, however, the two terms became largely interchangeable, both referring to this water-based punishment. This practice, while most famous in England, was widespread. Similar devices were used across Europe and were brought to the American colonies by settlers who used them to maintain strict Puritan social order. It was a method of control that spread across the Western world, yet one that seems utterly alien to the cultural history of a place like the Punjab. Ultimately, the ducking stool was seen as a symbolic act. It was meant to cool the heat of a hot-tempered woman or to wash away the sin of a sharp tongue. It was a brutal, theatrical, and deeply misogynistic form of justice, using the weapons of public ridicule and physical shock to keep women in their prescribed social place. We now sail back across the Atlantic to the shores of colonial America, a land of wild frontiers, revolutionary fervor, and a brand of justice that was often as rough as the landscape itself. In towns where official law could be miles away and passions ran high, communities often took matters into their own hands. This brings us to one of the most infamous and visually bizarre forms of mob justice: tarring and feathering. This was not a punishment handed down by a judge in a courtroom. It was a sentence delivered by an angry crowd. The targets were not typically murderers or violent criminals, but those who had violated the community's political or social codes. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, British tax collectors and loyalist sympathizers were the most frequent victims. It was a tool of political intimidation, pure and simple. The process began with the victim being seized by a mob and stripped of their clothing, usually to the waist. Then came the tar. Hot, liquid pine tar was poured or brushed over their exposed skin. While it wasn't usually boiling, it was heated enough to be liquid and to inflict painful burns, clinging to the skin like a thick, black second skin. While the tar was still hot and sticky, the second ingredient was applied: feathers. The victim was either rolled in a large pile of feathers, or had them thrown on him by the crowd until he was completely covered. The feathers adhered to the tar, transforming the person into a grotesque, monstrous caricature, something akin to a giant, malformed bird. The ordeal culminated in a parade of shame. The tarred and feathered victim was often forced to ride astride a sharp wooden rail, carried on the shoulders of the mob, and paraded through the town. This was the heart of the punishment: to be subjected to the jeers, insults, and ridicule of your entire community, to be stripped of all human dignity and turned into an object of scorn. The suffering did not end when the crowd dispersed. Removing the hardened tar was an agonizing and dangerous process. It often required harsh solvents like turpentine and hours of painful scraping, a process which would pull off not just the tar, but layers of skin along with it. This left the victim with raw, painful wounds, a high risk of infection, and the certainty of permanent scarring. The pain was a constant, burning reminder of the mob's fury, a stark contrast to the fleeting, quiet moments of a night that is now deep past 2 in the morning. This was the raw expression of mob rule, a form of justice born on a frontier far removed from the ancient, settled, legal traditions of a place like the Punjab. It was a community's way of physically marking someone as an outsider, an enemy. By turning a man into a feathered beast, the mob stripped him of his humanity, making any violence against him seem justified. Tarring and feathering was far more than a bizarre folk punishment. It was a potent political weapon. It was a way for a community to enforce its will, terrorize its opponents, and express its collective outrage in a visceral, sticky, and unforgettable spectacle. It was the messy, unofficial, and brutal enforcement arm of a revolution in the making. Let us now step forward in time, into the 19th century, the age of steam, industry, and the rigid, moralizing certainty of Victorian England. This was an era that believed in progress and reform, and this belief extended to its system of justice. In their search for a scientific way to punish criminals and cure them of their idleness, the Victorians invented a machine of soul-crushing monotony, the prison treadwheel. Invented in 1818 by an engineer named Sir William Cubitt, the treadwheel was not designed to be overtly brutal, but to break a prisoner's will through sheer, pointless exhaustion. Cubitt was allegedly inspired after seeing prisoners sitting idly in a jail yard, and he conceived of a machine that would force them into relentless, arduous labor, which he believed was the key to reforming their character. The device was a massive, long, hollow cylinder with wooden steps fixed to its exterior. Prisoners, often placed in individual stalls to prevent them from communicating, would have to climb these steps continuously. Their collective weight would cause the great wheel to turn, forcing them into a never-ending cycle of climbing that went nowhere. The genius and the cruelty of the treadwheel was that the labor it produced was often intentionally useless. While some treadwheels were used to pump water or grind grain, many were attached to cranks that did nothing but turn in the open air. This practice was grimly known as grinding the wind. The point was not productivity. The point was the monotonous, repetitive, and spirit-breaking work itself. A typical day for a prisoner on the treadwheel was grueling. They would often work in shifts of about 15 minutes on and 5 minutes off for as long as 8 to 10 hours a day. This endless climbing was physically devastating, but the mental toll was just as severe. The constant, pointless motion, day after day, was a form of psychological torture, a torment of monotony that makes even the slow, quiet passage of time at this deep hour of the night seem mercifully brief. The Victorians saw this as a rational, calculated punishment. It was clean, it was orderly, and it was based on the principle that hard labor would deter crime and instill a proper work ethic. In reality, it was a brutal system that often left prisoners physically broken, malnourished, and in a far worse state than when they entered. It was a cold, industrial approach to justice, born in the smog of London, a world away from the sun-baked earth of a place like Bournemouth. The treadwheel was a central component of what was known as the silent system. Inmates were forbidden from speaking, gesturing, or even making eye contact with one another. The goal was to force them into silent contemplation of their sins, with the monotonous drone of the wheel as the only soundtrack to their isolation. In a strange twist of history, this 19th century instrument of torture has a direct descendant in our modern lives. The exercise treadmill in any gym is a direct technological echo of the Victorian prison treadwheel. It's a curious thought that a device designed to break the human spirit has been repurposed into a tool we willingly use for health and well-being. From the grand industrial scale of the Victorian prison, let's now shrink our focus to the bustling streets of a medieval town and a crime that might seem minor today, but was then a serious offense against the community: baking underweight bread. In an age where bread was the very staff of life, cheating your customers on their daily loaf was a betrayal that the law did not take lightly. Under medieval English law, the assize of bread and ale strictly regulated the weight and price of these essential goods. A baker who was caught selling undersized loaves faced a punishment designed for maximum public humiliation. They were not thrown in a dungeon, but were instead tied to a wooden sled or hurdle, often with the fraudulent, lightweight loaf hanging around their neck like a mark of shame. The guilty baker was then dragged through the muddy, filthy, and crowded streets of the town. This was a spectacle for all to see. Their neighbors, their customers, and their competitors would mock and jeer as they were pulled through the muck. The goal was not physical harm, but the complete destruction of their professional reputation. After all, who would ever buy bread from a baker they had seen being publicly shamed for cheating? This very punishment is believed to be the origin of a phrase we still use today, the baker's dozen. To avoid any chance of accidentally violating the law and facing the horror of the sled, bakers began to add a 13th loaf to every order of a dozen. This extra loaf was a small insurance policy against a devastating public humiliation, ensuring they always gave good measure. Now, from the shame of being dragged through the streets, let us turn to a punishment that involved a very different and much more sinister kind of pressure. Let's travel to Tudor England and examine a torture device known as the scavenger's daughter. Invented during the reign of King Henry VIII, it was the conceptual opposite of the infamous rack. While the rack sought to stretch the body to its breaking point, the scavenger's daughter did the reverse. It compressed it. The device was a hinged iron frame shaped like the letter A. The victim was forced to kneel inside it, and the frame was tightened, forcing their head down to their knees and squeezing their body into an impossibly tight ball. The pressure exerted by this device was immense. It would slowly crush the victim's ribcage, shatter their sternum, and contort their spine. The compression was so severe that it would often force blood to burst from the victim's nose, ears, and fingertips. It was a terrifyingly intimate form of torture, a claustrophobic pressure that feels a world away from the wide-open spaces of a place like the Punjab, especially in the deep stillness of the pre-dawn hours. These two punishments, though from similar eras, show the varied nature of justice. One was a tool of social control for a common tradesman, using public shame as its weapon. The other was an instrument of state terror, used in the dark chambers of the Tower of London to extract confessions from traitors and heretics. One pulled you through the world, the other crushed the world in on you. Let us journey back once more to the ancient world, but this time we travel to the mighty Persian Empire, a civilization renowned for its art, architecture, and its own uniquely terrifying methods of justice. While we often hear of Roman and Greek punishments, the Persians conceived of a fate so foul, so psychologically horrifying, that it stands in a class of its own. It is known as scaphism, or more simply, the boats. The name comes from the Greek word scaft, meaning a trough or a boat. The concept was to turn a human being into a living feast for insects. The punishment began with a bizarre and cruel form of force-feeding. The condemned was made to ingest enormous quantities of milk and honey, a diet designed to induce severe and uncontrollable diarrhea. After this internal preparation, more milk and honey was smeared all over the victim's face, hands, and feet, any part of them that would be exposed. They were then placed inside a narrow, hollowed-out log or a small boat. A second boat was placed on top and bolted shut, creating a gruesome human-sized container that encased their body but left their head and limbs sticking out. This boat coffin was then pushed out onto a stagnant pond or swamp, left to bake in the hot sun. The honey and milk slathered on their skin would immediately begin to attract insects. Flies, wasps, and other vermin would swarm to them, feeding on the sweet mixture and on the victim themselves. It was a horrifying fate to be turned into a living buffet, a concept utterly alien to the arid climate of a place like Burwala. But the true horror was happening inside the boats. Trapped with their own filth from the forced diet, the victim's body would begin to decay while they were still alive. This would attract even more insects, which would burrow into their flesh to lay eggs. Maggots would hatch and begin to consume the person from the inside out. The ordeal was prolonged because attendants would reportedly return each day to feed the victim more milk and honey, keeping them alive to extend the suffering. Our most detailed account of this punishment comes from the Greek historian Plutarch, who described the death of a soldier who fell afoul of the Persian king. He wrote that the man suffered in this state for 17 days before finally succumbing to the septic shock and gangrene. It is an almost unimaginable length of time to endure such torment, especially when contemplated in the quiet, fleeting moments after 2:30 in the morning. Like some other extreme punishments from antiquity, the exact historicity of scaphism is debated, as the accounts come from the Greeks, the historical enemies of the Persians. It may be an exaggeration designed to paint them as monstrously cruel, but whether it was literally practiced or not, its description alone is a masterclass in psychological terror. Scaphism stands as a unique monument to human cruelty. It weaponized the processes of the natural world, digestion, decay, and the unceasing hunger of insects, turning the victim's own body against them. It was not a swift death from a blade, but a slow, biological nightmare, a complete and foul deconstruction of a human being. Let us now wander deep into the misty, ancient forests of medieval England. These were not public parks for recreation. They were the private hunting grounds of the king and his nobles, and they were governed by their own separate and notoriously harsh set of rules known as the forest law to the aristocracy. The deer and boar within were more valuable than the peasants who lived at the forest's edge, and the punishment for poaching was severe. The forest law was designed to protect two things above all: the venison, meaning the game animals like deer and wild boar, and the vert, the greenery and vegetation they needed to survive. A commoner caught hunting in the king's forest faced a justice far more brutal than for many other crimes. While stealing a neighbor's chicken might result in a fine, killing one of the king's stags could lead to blinding, the amputation of hands or feet, or even death. The laws were so strict they even extended to the dogs kept by peasants living within the forest boundaries. To prevent these dogs from being able to chase and hunt deer, they had to be lawed. This was a euphemism for mutilation. The dog would have several claws or a pad on its foot removed, permanently crippling it so it could not run effectively. The law valued the king's sport over a commoner's working animal. From the brutal certainty of the forest law, we now turn to a method of justice that relied on something far more ephemeral: the supernatural. Imagine a murder has been committed, but there are no witnesses, and no suspect will confess. In medieval and early modern Europe, some turned to a chilling ordeal to find their answer: the cruentation, or the ordeal of the buyer. This was a judicial ritual based on the ancient belief that the body of a murder victim would physically react to the presence of their killer. The corpse would be laid out on a bier, and the suspected murderer would be compelled to approach it. In some traditions, they were forced to lay their hands upon the body. It was believed that if the suspect was indeed the murderer, the victim's wounds would spontaneously begin to bleed afresh, or the body might foam at the mouth or move slightly. It was seen as a final, spectral accusation from beyond the grave, the corpse itself bearing witness against its killer. This was considered divine proof, an undeniable sign from God. This belief seems utterly fantastical to us now, in a scientifically literate world where the quiet hum of electricity marks the early morning. But for people of that time, it was a very real possibility. They saw it not as superstition, but as the natural order of a world where the spiritual and physical realms were deeply intertwined. These two forms of justice reveal a world grappling with power and proof. The forest law was the raw, top-down power of the aristocracy, valuing animal life over human liberty. The ordeal of the bier, in its own strange way, was an attempt to empower the ultimate victim, giving the dead a final chance to speak. Both were bizarre, and both delivered a form of justice that is almost unimaginable to us today. Our journey through the landscape of bizarre punishments now takes us to 16th century Germany, to the city of Munster, during the height of the Protestant Reformation. This was a time of religious upheaval, and in Munster, a group of radical Anabaptists attempted to create a new Jerusalem. Their rebellion was ultimately crushed, and the fate of its leaders became one of history's most enduring and visible warnings. The leaders of the rebellion, Jan van Leyden, Bernd Krechting, and Bernd Krechting, were captured after the city was retaken. Their initial punishment was exceptionally brutal. For hours, they were publicly tortured with red-hot tongs. Finally, their tongues were ripped out, and they were dispatched with a dagger thrust into the heart. But for the authorities, their death was not the end of their punishment. What followed was a bizarre and symbolic post-mortem desecration. The three men's bodies were placed into individual, custom-made iron cages. These were not elaborate works of art, but crude iron baskets, roughly shaped to hold a human form. They were instruments designed not for torture, but for a permanent, horrifying display. These three cages, containing the bodies of the rebel leaders, were then hoisted high up onto the steeple of St. Lambert's Church, the most prominent landmark in the city. There, suspended between heaven and earth, the bodies were left to rot, to be picked apart by crows, and to serve as a gruesome warning to anyone who looked up at the house of God. And here is the most surreal part of this story. The cages are still there. The bodies have long since turned to dust, but for nearly 500 years, those three empty iron cages have hung from the church tower. They have survived centuries of weather, the bombs of World War II, and the transition of Munster into a modern German city. They hang there still, silent through the ages, a constant reminder in the night sky, long after the world has fallen asleep, even now, at this quiet moment in a distant town like London. The symbolism was and remains incredibly potent. By hanging the leaders of a religious rebellion from the highest church in the city, the victorious Prince Bishop sent an unmistakable message. It was a declaration that the established church and state had absolute authority, and that any who dared to create their own kingdom of God on earth would meet a similar fate. The cages of Munster are a unique form of punishment because their legacy isn't confined to a history book or a museum. They are a physical, tangible link to a brutal past, integrated into the architecture of a living city. They are iron ghosts hanging over a bustling town square, a quiet but permanent testament to the grim consequences of a failed revolution. And so, our long journey through the night comes to a close. We have walked the dusty roads of ancient Rome, sailed the cold seas with pirates, stood in the shadow of medieval castles, and visited the grim prisons of the Victorian age. We have witnessed the strange, brutal, and sometimes profoundly creative ways that human societies have dealt with those who break their rules. From the spectacle of the Colosseum to the quiet horror of a heretic's fork, each punishment tells a story. Through these dark tales, we can see common threads. We see punishment as public theater, designed to awe and terrify a population into submission. We see it as a tool of social control, used to enforce the strict norms of a community, whether through a scold's bridle or a barrel of shame. And we see it as a deeply symbolic act meant to cleanse a spiritual stain, avenge an insult to a god, or even erase a person from memory itself. Slowly, over many centuries, the spectacle of public torture and execution began to fade in many parts of the world. The ideas of the Enlightenment, championed by thinkers who argued for justice that was rational and humane rather than cruel and arbitrary, began to take root. The focus shifted from punishing the body in public to confining it in private, giving rise to the modern prison system. So why do we, in the comfort and safety of our modern world, find ourselves drawn to these grim histories? Perhaps it is more than just morbid curiosity. By looking into the darkness of the past, we can better appreciate the light of the present. These stories remind us of our capacity for both cruelty and empathy, and they serve as a stark measure of how our understanding of justice has evolved. And the echoes of this past are all around us, often in ways we don't even realize. The phrase baker's dozen, the treadmills in our gyms, the very concept of being publicly shamed. These are all faint ghosts of the practices we have explored. These stories feel ancient, like tales from another world, especially when heard in the deep quiet of 2:34 a.m. in a place like Burwala. Yet their echoes are woven into the fabric of our language and culture. Let us close, then, with a final thought. As we've journeyed through this gallery of historical punishments, let's remember the countless, nameless individuals who endured these fates. The victims, the executioners, and the faces in the crowd were all people, living within systems of belief that made these acts seem necessary, just, or even righteous. Their stories are a humbling reminder of the human cost of justice throughout history. Thank you for joining me on this long exploration into the night. If you found these tales from history's darker side to be a fascinating, if somber, companion, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. Your support is what makes these deep dives into the past possible. Feel free to leave a comment below about which story you found the most unsettling. For now, I hope these stories have been a strange and soothing guide as you drift towards sleep. Rest well, and may your dreams be far more peaceful than the history we've revisited tonight.